A tree doesn't just fall across a mountain road the night before a billion-dollar board vote. Not like that. Not positioned perfectly across the only route down. Cole Stratham saw it and felt something cold move through him that had nothing to do with the temperature outside. He'd spent 11 years as a Navy SEAL reading situations for what they actually were, not what they appeared to be. And this road, this storm, this night, it wasn't bad luck stacking up. It was architecture. Someone had built this moment very carefully. And somewhere up that logging trail, they'd left something behind they weren't finished with yet. If this story already has your attention, you're in the right place. Subscribe to this channel and follow along until the very end, because the stories we tell here don't slow down. They only get sharper. Hit like if you're already hooked, and drop a comment with your city and country. I genuinely want to see how far this story travels. Don't miss what's coming next. The storm had been threatening since mid-afternoon, the kind of pressure drop weather that old ranchers around Red Hollow could feel in their knees 2 days before the clouds even arrived. By the time Cole Stratham finished the last repair at Denny's Auto and locked up the bay doors, the temperature had already fallen 12 degrees from the morning reading, and the sky above the Bitterroot Peaks had gone the color of a bruise. He didn't rush. He rarely did anymore. He drove a 10-year-old Ford pickup that he maintained himself, not because he couldn't afford something newer, but because he understood that machine completely, every tick and shudder it made, and there was a kind of quiet comfort in that. He knew exactly how it would handle on the logging roads above town when the temperature dropped and ice formed in the shaded corners. He'd driven those roads more times than he could count since moving to Red Hollow 6 years ago, first in disbelief that he'd actually left everything behind, then gradually in something closer to peace. Sadie had been 5 when they moved. She was 11 now, and had strong opinions about breakfast foods, her school's soccer coach, and the correct way to store firewood. Cole had raised her in a 2-bedroom house at the edge of town where the yard backed up against the tree line, and he'd found that the routine of that life, the ordinary, unremarkable weight of it, was the most grounding thing he'd ever known. He was thinking about whether he'd remembered to defrost the chicken for dinner when the tree stopped him cold. It lay directly across the county road, 6 miles below the junction where he'd normally turn for home. A lodgepole pine, maybe 14 inches in diameter, and it was positioned so cleanly across the asphalt that for a moment Cole just sat there with his headlights on it and his truck idling, feeling the back of his neck do something it hadn't done in years. He got out. The wind had picked up, and it bit at the exposed skin above his collar. He walked to the tree and crouched beside it, running his hand along the root ball where it had separated from the ground. The roots were pale, almost white, no soil packed into them, no deep-freeze darkness that comes from a tree that's been anchored in mountain ground for decades. This tree had been cut and cut recently enough that the wood hadn't begun to weather. Cole stood up and looked at the road. Then he looked at the logging trail that branched off to the northeast, heading up toward the old Halverson cabin. The trail was technically passable in a 4-wheel drive, though nobody used it anymore. The cabin itself had been sitting empty for 2 or 3 years. He looked at the tree again. He thought about driving back and going around on the highway, adding 40 minutes to his trip. He thought about calling the county road crew. Then he looked at the logging trail one more time. Something about the position of the tree bothered him in a way he couldn't immediately name. Not the fact of it, the angle, the way it lay oriented almost exactly perpendicular to the road, the root ball on the uphill side, as though it had been levered rather than simply pushed. Cole got back in his truck and took the logging trail. He drove slowly, using his high beams, and the trail climbed steadily through spruce and pine that closed in on both sides. The storm was thickening now, not snowing hard yet, but the air had that dense, charged quality that means heavy accumulation is maybe an hour away. Ice crystals ticked against the windshield. The Halverson cabin appeared in his headlights after about 1.5 miles. It was a plain structure, a single story, with a covered porch and a metal roof gone orange with rust at the edges. The woodpile beside the porch had been recently disturbed. He could see that immediately. Pieces scattered as though someone had pulled logs out and thrown them aside in frustration. There were boot prints in the thin layer of snow that had already accumulated. Multiple sets coming and going from the door. Cole sat in his truck for a long moment without turning off the engine. Then he noticed the door. It was closed, but the latch hardware was scratched in a particular way, gouge marks on the outside around the hasp, like something had been rigged to bar it from outside. From outside, he shut off his headlights. He sat in the dark and listened to his own breathing for 3 seconds. Then he got out of the truck, moved to the cab behind the seat, and took out the short-handled axe he kept there for clearing blown timber from the trail. He didn't go to the door. He went wide, circling in the tree shadow to the right side of the cabin, and stood under the side window, where the light from inside a faint, unsteady orange was just barely visible through the frost-covered glass. He looked in. A woman was lying on the floor beside a cast-iron wood stove. She was on her side, using her arm as a pillow, and she was wearing clothing that was completely wrong for this altitude, in this weather. A wool blazer, dress slacks, ankle boots. One of those boots was off, and even from outside Cole could see the swelling around her ankle that had turned the skin there an ugly, dark color. The stove beside her was cold, no glow in the firebox window. He watched her for 10 full seconds. She wasn't moving with the rhythm of sleep. She was barely moving at all. Cole went to the front door, studied the hasp one more time. Yes, it had been rigged, a bolt through the exterior hasp removed just recently, still clean of oxidation in the scratch, and opened the door. The cold inside the cabin hit him like stepping into a meat locker.
Hey.
He kept his voice level. "I'm coming in. I'm not going to hurt you." She moved barely. Her head lifted about 2 inches from her arm. Her eyes opened, but the focus wasn't there yet. Her voice was rough, lips barely moving. "There's no signal up here. I tried." "I know." He was already at the stove, opening the firebox. Stone cold hadn't held heat in hours. He looked at the woodpile in the corner. Almost nothing left. Someone had removed the bulk of it before locking her in here. "What's your name?" "Marlowe." A pause. "Marlowe Kessler." He found a few pieces of split kindling and a partial log behind the stove, and he pulled a road flare from his jacket pocket. He kept 2 there from October through April and used it to get the fire started. It wasn't elegant, but it worked. "Marlowe, can you sit up?" "My ankle." She pushed herself upright with clear pain, not trying to hide it, just breathing through it. "I think it might be broken. I tried to walk out this morning and I couldn't get far." Cole looked her over quickly. She was coherent, which meant no serious head injury. Her lips were pale but not blue. Her hands were tucked under her arms. Cold, but not hypothermic yet, though another few hours would have changed that. "How'd you end up here?" She hesitated, and he noticed that. He didn't push it. He handed her the thermal layer he kept behind his seat. The truck cab was never warm enough for Sadie to ride comfortably without it, and she pulled it around her without argument, which told him how cold she actually was. Because a woman in a blazer who'd arrived from somewhere that required dress slacks wasn't accustomed to accepting a stranger's hunting gear without at least a flicker of pride getting in the way first. "I drove up," she said, "on the access road the other side of the ridge. My SUV went into a ditch about a quarter-mile back. I couldn't get it out." She paused. "I found this cabin." "Found it, yes." Cole sat back on his heels and let the fire establish itself. The kindling was catching. It wasn't much, but it was something. "Did you try the generator?" he asked. The pull cord broke. He stood, went to the generator in the corner, and examined the fuel line. In the dim firelight, he had to look close, but he found it in about 4 seconds. A clean cut, maybe 3 inches from the inline filter. Not frayed from age, not cracked from cold. Cut. The edge was still sharp. He didn't say anything yet. He went to the communications box on the wall, an old emergency antenna set up, the kind that remote cabins in this area used to have, and lifted the cover panel. The antenna cable had been disconnected from the base unit and looped back on itself, the connector end tucked behind the box, so it would take someone a moment to find. Someone who knew what they were looking at. He connected it and checked the unit. Power was live. The antenna itself seemed intact. He replaced the cover and turned back to Marlowe. She was watching him now with considerably more focus than she'd had 2 minutes ago, the fire doing its work, and her eyes were tracking him in the way of someone who'd spent a career reading rooms. "You're not just a man who found this cabin by accident," she said. "Neither are you." She held his gaze for a moment. "What did you find?" "Fuel line's been cut on your generator. Communications cable was disconnected by hand. It didn't fail. Somebody pulled it loose." He paused. "The woodpile's been mostly cleared out. Door was barred from outside, and the hardware's been scratched clean, like someone removed a bolt recently." Marlowe was very still. "And there's a tree down across the county road," he said, "that was cut, not blown over." She didn't speak for a few seconds. Then, "You're certain about all of this?" "I'm certain about everything I just said." "Yeah, who are you?" "Cole Stratham. I'm a mechanic in Red Hollow." She looked at him with the expression of someone doing rapid math in their head. A mechanic who examined all of that in. She glanced at the door. 3 minutes. "I noticed what I noticed." Marlowe looked away toward the fire. The color was coming back to her face, slowly, but she was holding something back and Cole could see it, the deliberate control of a person who'd spent years in rooms where showing fear was a kind of surrender. "They weren't going to find me here," she said. It wasn't a question. Not quickly. Not in a storm. Cole pulled one of the cabin's chairs closer to the stove and sat down. Someone wanted time to pass. How much time exactly depends on what they needed it for. One morning. Her voice was quiet. They needed one morning. He waited. "There's a board meeting," she said. "Tomorrow, 8 a.m. She pressed her fingers to her temple. "Kessler North Star. I'm the CEO. If I'm not sitting in that chair at 8 o'clock, she stopped. "Someone else will be," Cole finished. Marlowe looked at him. It was a direct look. The look of someone deciding in real time how much to trust a stranger in a burning house. "Yes," she said. Cole stood and did something she clearly didn't expect. He went to the door, opened it, and stepped outside into the dark. He stood on the porch and let his eyes adjust. The storm was close now, the sky pressing down in that flat, heavy way. He let his gaze move slowly across the clearing, the tree line, the road that wound up from the ridge below. That's when he saw them. Headlights, low on the road, maybe a mile below the cabin, moving steadily upward. A road that should have been gated and closed hours ago. Cole went back inside and shut the door quietly. Marlowe looked at him from the floor. "We need to move," he said. "I can't walk, I'll help you." He was already scanning the cabin. One rear window, small but passable. Back of the property dropped off into forest that would give them cover. "But we need to go in the next 4 minutes, because whoever is coming up that road isn't lost." "How do you know that?" Cole looked at her steadily. "Because they're not driving like they're lost. They're driving like they know exactly where they're going." Marlowe didn't argue. She began pulling herself toward the window without being asked a second time. Whatever she'd been before this night, whatever distance the title and the board meetings and the billion-dollar company created between her and ordinary survival, she was shedding it fast. Cole helped her to her feet, took most of her weight on his right side, and began moving them toward the back of the cabin. Outside, the storm was finally arriving. Snow starting to fall in earnest, thick and wind-driven. Somewhere below, headlights kept climbing. They went out through the rear window one at a time, Cole first so he could catch her when she dropped. Marlowe came through feet first, and when her injured ankle hit the ground, she made a sound that wasn't quite a gasp, and wasn't quite a word, just a compressed involuntary noise that she swallowed immediately. Cole steadied her with both hands, and she didn't lean into him any longer than she had to. The snow was falling properly now, heavy and wind-angled, and the temperature had dropped another 4 or 5 degrees since he'd first stepped out of his truck. Cole pulled her arm across his shoulder, and they moved into the tree line behind the cabin, pushing through knee-high drifts where the wind had piled it against the roots. He kept them moving parallel to the slope, not uphill, not downhill lateral movement that would be harder to track because it didn't follow any logical route a person would choose without training. Behind them, through the trees and the sound of the wind, he could hear an engine, then doors. 1, 2, then silence. They were at the cabin. He didn't stop moving. Marlowe was breathing hard, but she wasn't complaining. That surprised him, though he didn't let it show. He'd expected more resistance, not from stubbornness, but from simple unfamiliarity with pain, as a thing you just carry and keep going. Most people, when their ankle was swollen to the size of a grapefruit, and they were moving through dense forest in the dark in a Montana winter storm, started negotiating. She wasn't negotiating. She was just breathing through it and matching his pace as closely as she could. After about 300 yards, he brought them to a stop behind a deadfall spruce, crouching low, and listened. The voices were muffled by distance and weather, but he could hear 2 of them, coming from the direction of the cabin, moving around its perimeter. Flashlight beams tracked through the trees above the cabin roofline. "They'll find the window," he said quietly. "How long before they come after us?" 4 minutes. Maybe less if one of them has tracking experience. He looked at her. "Can you keep moving at this pace?" She considered the question with what seemed like genuine honesty rather than pride. For a while. "Yes, tell me when you can't, I will." He believed her, which surprised him too. They kept moving. The rental SUV was where Marlowe said it was about a 1/4 mile back from the cabin, along the access road that came over the ridge from the eastern side, nose down in a drainage ditch with the front right wheel completely off the ground. The rear of the vehicle was still on the road surface, and when Cole looked at the tire tracks leading up to the ditch, he could see exactly what had happened. The car had been moving, had hit something on the road surface, and overcorrected, and gone in fast enough that the airbags had partially deployed. The road surface. He crouched and found it with his flashlight, a length of heavy chain, partially buried in fresh snow now, across the road at an angle that would deflect a tire at speed. The chain had already been there when the snow started falling. It had been placed deliberately. He didn't say anything to Marlowe. Not yet. She was standing a few feet behind him, most of her weight on her good foot, watching him with the patient attentiveness of someone who'd learned that the person currently keeping them alive should be allowed to think without interruption. He went to the passenger side of the SUV and opened the rear door. The inside of the car was a mess. Her bag had gone off the seat during the impact, spilling its contents across the floor. He found her phone immediately, picked it up. No signal, same as she'd said. The screen had a hairline crack across the upper right corner, but it was functional. He started feeling under the front passenger seat. "What are you looking for?" Marlowe asked from the doorway. "Anything that shouldn't be here." He pushed his hand further back, along the underside of the seat frame. His fingers found it before his eyes did, a rectangular shape, smooth, taped to the underside of the seat rail with a single strip of electrical tape. He peeled it free and looked at it in the flashlight beam. A black flash drive, no labels, no markings. He turned it over in his hand. "Is this yours?" he asked. Marlowe stared at it. Her expression shifted through several things in quick succession: recognition, confusion, and then something that looked very much like understanding arriving at the worst possible moment. "No," she said, "it's not mine. But you know what it is." She was quiet for a moment. "I think I might know who put it there." Cole looked at the drive, then at her. "Then I think you need to tell me why you came up here alone." She told him, and she didn't dress it up. Wesley Price had been a senior internal auditor at Kessler Northstar for 9 years, before he left the company 14 months ago, under circumstances that had been described officially as a mutual parting. He'd contacted Marlowe 3 weeks ago, through a secure channel, not a company channel, a personal encrypted message routed through 2 layers of anonymizing software, which told her immediately that whatever he had to say, he was frightened. He claimed he had documentation, financial records, transaction logs, routing information, evidence that over the previous 3 years, somewhere between $40 and $60 million had been moved through a constellation of shell companies, some overseas, some domestic, that were quietly backed by Kessler Northstar Capital. The money didn't disappear. It was relocated, redirected, layered through enough structures that tracing it required knowing what you were looking for before you could see it. He said he knew who had built the structure. He said he had names. He said he wanted to give everything directly to Marlowe, in person, before he would talk to anyone else, investigators, lawyers, anyone. He didn't trust digital transmission. He didn't trust the company's legal team. He specifically said that the information could not reach the right people through normal company channels, because the right people inside the company were the wrong people. They'd arranged to meet at the cabin, his idea, his location, remote enough that no one would have a reason to follow either of them. One meeting. She'd drive up alone. He'd drive in from the other side. They'd talk. She'd take whatever he brought, and then decide the next steps with proper legal counsel on neutral ground. And he didn't show, Cole said. He didn't show. Marlowe's voice had gone careful and flat. The tone of someone reviewing a decision they'd already accepted was a mistake, but weren't going to spend time flagellating themselves over. "I waited 2 hours. I tried to call him, no signal. I tried to leave, and that's when I went into the ditch." She paused. "I thought it was an accident. I thought the chain I didn't know about the chain. I thought I just lost control." Cole rolled the flash drive between his thumb and forefinger. "Wesley Price put this under your seat before the meeting. He didn't trust any single point of delivery, so he planted a backup in your car before you drove up. He must have had access to the rental lot. He would have known which car." She stopped. "He knew the make and model because I told him. Part of the arrangements. He's careful. He's terrified," she said, and there was no judgment in it. "There's a difference." Cole looked at the flash drive one last time and closed his fist around it, tucking it into his inside jacket pocket against his chest. It was too cold for the exterior pockets to be reliable for something electronic. "We can't stay here," he said. "The car's visible from the trail, and when those 2 don't find us at the cabin, they'll expand their search." "Where do we go?" He looked up the slope to the northeast. There was a fire lookout tower about 2 miles through the trees. He'd been up there twice in the past 3 years. Once with Satie on a summer hike, and once in the fall checking whether the access trail was usable for a search and rescue training he'd been asked to consult on. It was high, isolated, and had emergency supplies that were restocked every season by the county. More importantly, it had an emergency radio setup that was separate from the cabin's system, different installation, different antenna, and nobody had had a reason to tamper with it. "I know a place," he said, "but it's a hard 2 miles. Marlowe looked at her ankle, then back at him. "Then we should start now while I still have the adrenaline." They were 40 minutes into the climb through the forest when the voices arrived below them. Not shouting, not panicked. Calm, directed voices, the kind used by people who were conducting a methodical search rather than stumbling around in the dark. Cole stopped them under a dense stand of young pines, their branches overlapping enough that the falling snow hadn't penetrated much beneath them, and held completely still while he listened. 2 voices, definitely 2, moving along the access road below, not through the forest yet. They were following the vehicle tracks. "They'll find the SUV," he said, barely above a murmur. "What do we do?" Cole thought for exactly 3 seconds, which was longer than it sounds when someone is waiting for an answer in the dark. "We keep moving. Uphill from here, the terrain gets steep enough that they'll need equipment they don't have if they want to follow quickly. The snow's covering our tracks." He looked at the angle of the slope ahead. "The fire lookout has a clear line of sight down the valley. We'll know if they come up the mountain." "Okay," she said. Simple as that. He'd known special operations personnel who stalled longer on simpler decisions under less pressure. He didn't say that either. They had been climbing for another 20 minutes, pushing through a section where the slope tilted sharply, and the snow was hip-deep in the open channels between the trees, when they heard the engine noise from below change character. Heavier. A different vehicle, or the same one being driven uphill. Then the beam of a spotlight swept across the mountainside, through the trees high-powered, rotating slowly. "They're scanning the slope," Cole said. Marlowe pressed herself against the tree beside her. The light moved across them once, twice, tracking through the branches 20 feet above. It missed them by the margin of the tree cover and the particular angle of the slope. Cole didn't move during it. Not a muscle. The light moved on. He exhaled slowly. "Okay, we're fine." "You're very calm," Marlowe said, and she said it without inflection, not as a compliment and not as an accusation. "Just an observation. Getting upset doesn't change the terrain," he said. She made a sound that might have been a short, exhausted laugh. "I've said something like that in boardrooms before. It lands differently up here." "Most things do." They kept climbing. The fire lookout emerged from the darkness like a skeletal hand reaching out of the mountain, a 40-foot steel tower with a small enclosed cab at the top, its stairs zigzagging upward in 3 flights. The platform was iced. The cab door was padlocked with a county forestry lock that Cole had seen before on access points during the search and rescue consult. He knew the key type. He also knew, from years of working with locks that people assumed were secure, that this particular model had a vulnerability at the cylinder housing when the temperature dropped below 15 degrees. The metal contracted differently than the lock body, and if you applied lateral pressure at the right angle while using the pick of a multi-tool, the cylinder would give. It took him about 3 minutes. Marlowe sat on the bottom step and didn't watch, which he appreciated. Inside the cab was small 8 feet by 8 feet, windows on all 4 sides, a fold-down bench, emergency supply cabinet, and the radio setup. The supplies were basic: 2 foil emergency blankets, a first aid kit, a hand-crank lantern, and 3 days of freeze-dried rations. He found the first aid kit and brought it to Marlowe. "Let me look at your ankle." She had taken the boot off during the climb, he'd insisted, because a boot that tight over that kind of swelling was cutting off circulation, and was walking on it wrapped in the thermal layer he had given her, tied at the top. When he unwrapped it now in the lantern light, the swelling had gotten worse. The discoloration ran from mid-foot up around the outside of the ankle joint, deep purple edging toward black along the bony prominences. "That needs imaging," he said. "I know, I can wrap it for support. It's going to hurt. It already hurts." She looked at him directly. "Do it." He had the elastic bandage from the first aid kit, and he wrapped it in a figure-8 pattern, firm enough to provide real support without compressing the swelling further. She didn't make a sound during it. Her jaw was set, and her hands were flat on the bench on either side of her, and she was staring at the wall with the focused blankness of someone using a technique they'd developed for exactly this kind of situation. He tied it off, and she let out a slow breath. "Thank you. Don't walk on it any more than you have to," he said, which was almost funny given the last 2 hours. He turned to the radio. The radio setup was an older model, an emergency transceiver using a combination of VHF and a legacy military distress frequency band that was increasingly uncommon but still monitored by certain units. The antenna was mounted on the exterior rail of the platform, and it was intact. Power came from a hand-cranked generator, and Cole spent 90 seconds cranking it before he checked the signal. Weak, but present. He began working on the radio's configuration, pulling out a wire from the back of the housing and wrapping it around the antenna terminal to boost the signal gain. It wasn't a clean fix. It was the kind of improvised solution that worked maybe 60% of the time, and the other 40% just introduced noise. He tried it and checked the meter. Better. Not great, but better. Marlowe was watching him from the bench. If you're a small-town mechanic, you're a very unusual one. I fix things, he said without turning around. Engines, mostly. But the principle's the same. Is it? He didn't respond to that. Who are you going to call? She asked. I don't know yet. Depends on what frequencies I can reach from this elevation. He paused. First, I want to understand what's on that drive. Do you have a laptop? In my bag, which is in the SUV. He thought about that. Then we work with what we know. He turned from the radio and looked at her. You said Wesley Price had names. Whose names? Marlowe was quiet for a moment, in a way that told him she'd deciding whether to answer that since before he asked. He implied it was someone inside executive leadership. Someone with access to capital allocation and the operational authority to create the shell company infrastructure without triggering internal compliance flags. She paused. That narrows it considerably. How many people fit that description? At Kessler North Star? 4, myself included, so 3. Yes. And you have a board meeting tomorrow at 8 in the morning where, if you're not present, someone else takes effective control of the company's decision-making. A specific vote, she said, on a restructuring proposal that has been moving through the board for 6 months. If it passes, it realigns the company's operational divisions in a way that would make certain irregularities significantly harder to trace after the fact. The restructuring itself might be entirely legitimate, but the timing of it, combined with what Wesley described, she stopped. Combined with someone making sure you aren't in your chair when the vote happens, Cole said. Yes. He looked at her steadily. Marlowe, who do you think it is? She held his gaze for a long moment. The lantern light was throwing shadows across her face, and she looked, in that moment, very tired, not physically, or not only physically, but tired in the particular way of someone who'd been carrying a suspicion for weeks and had been hoping they were wrong. Damian Rusk, she said. He's my COO. He's been with the company 11 years. He's competent, he's trusted, and he has more operational access than anyone below me. She paused again. And 6 weeks ago, I noticed something small, a discrepancy in a routing table for our Western logistics operations that shouldn't have existed. I flagged it to Damian directly. What did he say? He said he'd look into it. Her voice was very even. 2 weeks later, Wesley Price contacted me. Cole absorbed that for a moment. So when you flagged the discrepancy to Damian, he knew you were getting close. And sometime in the next 2 weeks, Wesley Price decided he needed to talk to you directly and immediately. That's the sequence, yes. And then someone arranged for you to drive up a mountain alone to meet a man who never showed up, in a cabin with a cut fuel line and a disconnected radio. Marlowe didn't answer, because the answer was sitting in the room with them. Cole turned back to the radio. He'd been working through the problem the way he'd been trained to, stripping it down to its operational components, understanding what each piece meant in relation to the others. The shell companies, the restructuring vote, the flash drive hidden under the seat. Those were the financial architecture of the thing. But the operational architecture was separate, and that was what interested him right now. Because someone had deployed 2 men in search and rescue clothing, had organized a blocked road, a vehicle trap, a disabled cabin, a timed meeting with a man who either wouldn't or couldn't show up. That wasn't improvised. That was planned, resourced, and executed with the kind of lead time that said the planning had started before Wesley Price even made contact with Marlowe, which meant whoever had built this operation had known about Price's intentions before Marlowe did. You need to know something, he said without turning from the radio. Tell me, the people who came to the cabin tonight, the ones in search and rescue gear, he paused. They knew exactly where you were. Not approximately exactly. No legitimate rescue team gets mobilized that fast, and no legitimate rescue team comes up a gated road in the middle of a storm without any coordination with county dispatch. Marlowe was very still. There's no missing person report on you, he continued. I'd bet money on it, because a report creates a record, and a record creates attention, And neither of those things works for someone who needs your absence to look like an accident or a weather incident. They weren't there to rescue me, she said. No. They were there for the drive. He finally turned to look at her. They asked for it before you'd even told them it existed. The weight of that landed on her fully, and he watched her let it, not flinching away from it. She had the quality rare, and not always comfortable to be around, of someone who looked at hard information directly, instead of trying to negotiate with it. How did they know about the drive if I didn't even know it was there until you found it? She asked. Because whoever sent them knows what Wesley Price prepared. They've been tracking him. Cole set down the wire he'd been working with. Price planted that drive as insurance a dead drop, essentially. He was afraid the meeting would go wrong, so he hid a backup copy of whatever he has in the one place he could access before you drove up, your rental car. He accessed my rental car. He had your make, model, and probably your plate from the meeting coordination. Not difficult. Cole looked at the drive in his hand. The people after you know the drive exists. They know Price made a copy. They don't know where it is, but they know it's somewhere, and they know that if it reaches the right people before 8 a.m. tomorrow, everything Damian Rusk has built falls apart. Marlowe's jaw tightened. He's not just trying to keep me away from the vote. No, he needs the drive. And he needs the vote. And he needs you either absent, discredited, or Cole stopped there. Or not found until the storm clears, she finished quietly. By which point it would look like a terrible accident. Cole nodded once. She absorbed that for a moment, sitting very still on the bench in the lantern light with her wrapped ankle extended and her hands folded in her lap. Then she straightened her back and looked at the radio. Can you reach anyone with that? Working on it. Then work on it. He turned back to the radio. Outside, the wind was driving the snow horizontally against the windows, and the temperature inside the cab had dropped enough that their breath was visible. He could see his own hands were moving slightly slower than he wanted them to, the cold working into his fingers despite his gloves. And below them, somewhere down the mountainside, he could hear the sound of a vehicle engine that hadn't gone away. It had gotten closer. Cole worked faster. He reconfigured the antenna wire a second time, trying a different impedance match, and checked the frequency range the unit could cover. There was one frequency in the upper UHF range, an old authenticated military distress band, technically decommissioned from standard use, but still monitored by certain active and reserve units that maintained legacy communication protocols. He knew the band because he'd used it operationally for years. He knew the authentication identifier because it was embedded in memory the same way his own name was. He dialed it in. He looked at the meter. The signal was weak, fractured by the mountain terrain and the storm interference. Maybe enough. Maybe not. He keyed the transmitter and spoke the identifier, a short alphanumeric sequence that meant nothing to anyone who didn't know what it was, and meant everything to anyone who did. Then he released the key and waited, static. The engine below was still climbing. Marlowe watched him from the bench without speaking, reading the situation with her own experience of waiting on information that may or may not arrive in time. Cole keyed the transmitter a second time and sent the identifier again. Slower, cleaner static, then just at the edge of it a response. Broken, patchy, barely coherent through the storm interference. But there, Cole closed his eyes for exactly 1 second. Then he opened them and began working the radio to narrow the frequency, trying to clean the signal enough to carry a real message. Behind him, Marlowe said quietly, "Someone's answering." "Yeah," he said. "Someone's answering." And then the radio below them, a different radio, one that Cole had not touched. The emergency unit mounted on the cabin's exterior wall circuit that he'd reconnected to the antenna earlier crackled to life with a signal strong enough to fill the cab. Not static. A voice calm, measured. The voice of a man accustomed to speaking in situations where the wrong word carried real consequence. "Miss Kessler," the voice said, "I think it's time we spoke directly." Cole recognized the approach, not the voice, but the technique. The deliberate calm, the use of her name to establish that he knew exactly who and where she was. The implication of control. Damian Rusk had found a way to reach the emergency frequency. And he was speaking to them like a man who thought he was already winning. Marlowe looked at Cole. He looked at her. Cole reached over and pressed the transmit key on the cabin radio so Damian would know they were listening. And then he let Damian talk. Damian Rusk had a good voice for a man doing something terrible. That was the first thing Cole noticed, not the words, but the instrument. Measured, resonant, with the unhurried cadence of someone who'd spent years in rooms where speaking slowly was a form of dominance. He didn't rush. He didn't fill the silence with nervous explanation. He let the radio carry his voice into the cab of the fire lookout, the way a man opens a door into a room he already owns. "I want you to understand that none of this needed to happen this way," Damien said. "Whatever you've been told about my intentions, Marlowe, the reality is considerably more practical than the story makes it sound." Marlowe looked at Cole. He held up 2 fingers and shook his head slightly. "Don't answer yet. Let him keep going." She understood immediately and looked back at the radio without speaking. "You've clearly found help. That's fine. What I need you to understand is that the situation you're in right now is entirely recoverable. You're cold, you're hurt, you're a long way from a road that anyone is going to find before morning. Those are facts. But they're not permanent facts. A pause perfectly timed. Here's what I'm offering. You give me the drive whatever Wesley planted, wherever it is, and you stay away from the board tomorrow. Tell them you were delayed by the storm. No one questions a weather event. You keep your title, your equity, your reputation. The company moved forward. You move forward." Marlowe's jaw was tight. Cole watched her face. She was running the logic of it, not the emotion, which told him something about how she operated under pressure. "And if I don't," she said, before Cole could stop her. He'd expected more hesitation from her. He should have known better by now. There was a brief silence on the other end. Just brief enough to suggest Damien was pleased. She'd responded that he'd been hoping she would, because engagement was a form of control. "I don't think threats serve either of us at this point," Damien said. "Let's be adult about it. You know how exposure works. Wesley Price is, let's say, he's no longer in a position to corroborate anything personally. And whatever he prepared, without supporting testimony, is considerably less damaging than you might hope. Documents alone tell a story. Documents with a living, credible witness tell a case. Right now you have one and not the other." The warmth in his voice, when he said that the practiced, almost sympathetic tone was the ugliest part of it. He was telling her that Wesley Price was either dead or taken, and he was doing it the way a lawyer delivers bad news at a settlement table. Cole felt something tighten in his chest that had nothing to do with the cold. He reached over and pressed the transmit key. "Where's Price?" Another silence. Longer this time. "That's a new voice," Damien said. "Answer the question." "I'm not sure who you are," Damien said, "but I'd encourage you to think carefully about the degree to which this is your problem. Right now you're a bystander. That's a very comfortable position. There's no reason for it to change." "Where is Wesley Price?" Cole said again. Damien didn't answer that directly. What he said instead was, "The man with Ms. Kessler. I'd like to know your name." Cole released the transmit key and said nothing. Marlowe was watching him with an expression he'd seen before, not often, but enough times to recognize it. It was the look of someone recalibrating who they thought they were dealing with. He'd been a mechanic from Red Hollow who found her in a cabin. He'd been competent, calm, clearly trained in something. But there was a quality in the way he'd just handled Damien Rusk on that radio, the flat patience, the selective silences, the single direct question asked twice that was different from competent. That was practiced. "Who are you?" she asked, not accusing, genuinely asking. Cole was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind had dropped just enough that they could hear the storm in its individual components, the creak of the tower steel, the tick of ice against the glass, and somewhere far below, the idling engine of a vehicle that was still on the mountain. He owed her the truth, not because of some abstract principle, but because the next several hours were going to require her to trust his decisions completely, and you couldn't ask someone to do that while hiding the thing that made those decisions worth trusting. "Before I moved to Red Hollow," he said, "I spent 14 years in the Navy, 11 of those in the SEALs. Cold weather mountain operations, personnel recovery, covert insertion and extraction." He said it the way you say something you've put down, not ashamed of it, not proud of it in the moment, just accurate. "I left 6 years ago when my wife died. I have a daughter. She was 5. I decided that was where I needed to be." Marlowe was very still. "Her name is Sadie," he continued. "She's 11 now. She has strong opinions about everything, and she's the best thing I've ever done." He paused. "I didn't tell you earlier because it wasn't relevant. It's relevant now." Marlowe took a breath. It was the kind of breath that contains a lot of things: adjustment, reassessment, something almost like relief, though she would have resisted that word. "Why did you really take the logging trail tonight?" she asked. "You could have turned around." "The tree bothered me," he said simply. "That's it?" That was enough. She looked at him for a moment longer, then looked at the radio. "Damien's still on frequency, I know." Cole turned back to the equipment. He's waiting to see if I'll identify myself. He won't wait long. He'll have someone monitoring the frequency, trying to locate the transmission point. He checked the antenna configuration again. We have maybe 4 minutes before they triangulate the signal well enough to confirm our position. And then they know we're in the lookout instead of somewhere on the open mountainside. He began reconfiguring the transmit power, dropping it lower power. Meant shorter range but a harder signal to locate precisely. It was a trade-off. But right now I need you to listen to something. Not to what Damien said, but to what he didn't say. She straightened slightly, listening. He didn't threaten you with physical harm directly. He offered you a deal. He mentioned your reputation, your equity, your title. Cole kept his hands moving on the radio while he spoke. That's a negotiation, and a negotiation means he's not certain he has everything he needs yet. If he were certain, if he had the drive, or if he had the board locked up completely, he would have stopped communicating and just waited out the storm. Marlowe was quiet, following the logic. He's also on a deadline, Cole continued. The board meeting is at 8 a.m. It's currently. He glanced at his watch, 11:43 at night. He has 8 hours and change, but he needs you either compliant or absent, and he needs the drive out of play. Right now, he has neither. Cole looked at her. That makes him dangerous, but it also makes him pressed. Pressed people make choices they wouldn't otherwise make. So what do we do? She asked. We don't fight him, Cole said. We beat his clock. She stared at him. How? He turned back to the radio and switched frequency away from the emergency band to a specific UHF channel that was narrow enough to carry a clear signal at short range, but obscure enough that no one would be scanning it without a reason. He reconfigured the antenna output again, pushing the gain in a specific direction northeast toward the valley floor where the terrain opened up and signal could travel further without obstruction. Then he picked up the transmit key and sent the authentication identifier a third time. Slow, clean, correct the specific sequence of alphanumeric code that, to anyone outside of a particular subset of the naval special warfare community, sounded like random noise on a dead channel. He released the key. Marlowe said, "You sent that before." At the other frequency, I sent it twice. This is a different frequency, different reach. He watched the meter. What I sent is a legacy distress identifier. It's been officially decommissioned from standard use. But there are units that still monitor legacy bands as part of their communication protocols, either for training continuity or because someone in their command structure is old enough to have insisted on it. He paused. And there's one person specifically who I know monitors it. Because he and I argued about decommissioning it 8 years ago and I lost the argument. And 2 years later he told me he'd kept monitoring it anyway because he hated being wrong.
Who is he?
His name is Silas Varden, commander currently attached to a reserve coordination unit out of Great Falls. He was my team leader for 4 years. Cole watched the meter. If he's on rotation tonight, or if he has anyone monitoring that channel. The radio crackled, not static, not Damien Rusk's measured voice. A different voice entirely. Shorter sentences. A directness that was almost abrasive after Damien's careful cadence. Authentication received, identify. Cole pressed transmit immediately. Stratham, Cole, former E7 Team 6, cold weather attachment. Current position, he gave the grid reference he'd worked out from the lookout's posted coordinates and his knowledge of the valley orientation. Fire, lookout, northeast ridge above Red Hollow. 2 personnel. 1 injured, non-ambulatory without assistance. Hostile elements on the mountain. Minimum 2 contractors. Vehicle supported. Arm status unknown. I need extraction at. He pulled up his mental map of the surrounding terrain. At the abandoned military LZ on the mountain shoulder. Designation R7 from the old forestry mapping. Do you copy? Pause. Copy, Stratham. Stand by. Marlowe was staring at him. He didn't look at her yet. The voice came back in less than 90 seconds. LZR7 is on the map. Weather window is narrow. Storm is rotating. There's a break projected between 0400 and 0530. That's your window. Copy, Cole said. Can you make it? Another pause, shorter this time. You sent me a decommissioned identifier on a dead channel at midnight in a Montana blizzard. Stratham. What do you think? Cole allowed himself one small private exhale. I think you're going to make me owe you for the rest of my life. You already did. This just adds to the tab. Brief pause then. LZR 0400. Don't be late. The channel went quiet. Cole set down the transmit key and turned to Marlowe. She was looking at him with an expression that had moved past recalibration into something closer to raw honesty, the look of someone who'd stopped managing their reaction and was just having it. You just called in a military helicopter, she said. A friend with access to a military helicopter, he said. There's a difference. Is there? He almost smiled. In terms of paperwork, yes. Significantly. The radio crackled again at 12 minutes past midnight, and this time it was Damien Rusk. And this time the measured calm in his voice had developed a hairline fracture. I'm going to be direct with you now, Damien said. The man you're with, I've had time to think about who might be in Red Hollow with that kind of background. There aren't many candidates. A pause. I know about the daughter. Sadie. 11 years old, goes to Red Hollow Elementary, plays soccer on Saturdays. The cab of the Lookout went very quiet. Cole was facing the radio. His expression didn't change. Not because he was unaffected, the mention of Sadie's name hit him in a place that had nothing to do with training or discipline or 11 years of operating in hostile environments. It hit him in the place where he was simply her father, and it hurt the way that kind of thing always hurts. Sharp and immediate and poorly located, somewhere behind the sternum where nothing professional can reach. But he'd learned a long time ago that the first thing a person does when they're running out of options is reach for something that hurts. And a threat that has to be spoken out loud is a threat that hasn't been acted on yet. He pressed transmit. If anything happens to my daughter Damien, the conversation about that drive becomes a very different kind of conversation. And you know that. He released the key. Silence. Then I'm not threatening a child. I'm making sure you understand the scope of what you're involved in. This is larger than one night on a mountain. Then act like it, Cole said. If you were winning, you wouldn't be on this radio right now. He released the key and stepped back from the unit. Marlowe was on her feet, difficult, painful, using the bench for support, and she was looking at him with the specific expression of someone who is about to do something they know is a mistake, but cannot stop themselves from doing. Give him the drive, she said. Marlowe. He mentioned your daughter. Her voice was very controlled, but something underneath it wasn't. Cole. Give him the drive. Tell him we'll stay away from the board meeting. I can rebuild. I have the audit trail in my own records. I can work with investigators directly without the drive. It'll take longer, but... Stop, he said. She stopped. He looked at her directly. Damien mentioned Sadie because he's desperate. If he had actual capability to move against her tonight, he wouldn't have told us about it. First, he would have just done it and used it as leverage. The fact that he said her name out loud means he's trying to create fear he can trade on, because he doesn't have anything else left to trade. Cole held her gaze. Sadie is safe. She's at home. Red Hollow is a small town and she's 11 years old and asleep in her bed, and the two contractors Damien has on this mountain are on this mountain, not in Red Hollow. Marlowe held his gaze for a long moment. You're sure? I'm not completely sure, he said honestly. I'm 90% sure, and in a situation like this, that's the most certain anyone can be. But I know this, if we give him the drive, it disappears. The restructuring vote passes in the morning, and whatever Wesley Price risked his life to document gets buried under enough legal architecture that it never sees daylight. He paused. Damien wins, and he wins because we let him frighten us into handing him the thing he needed. Marlowe stood with her weight on her good foot, and her hands gripping the bench, and she looked at the radio, then at the window, then at the dark mountainside beyond the glass where the snow was driving sideways in the wind. Okay, she said finally. Her voice was steadier than he expected. Okay, what's the plan? Cole turned to the window and looked northeast, working the geography in his mind. The military LZ designated R7 on the old forestry mapping was a cleared mountain shoulder that had been used for training exercises 15 years ago and had been maintained afterward in the clearing records, but not in active use. He'd identified it on the search and rescue consult map because it was one of the few flat surfaces above 4,000 feet within 5 miles that could accommodate a helicopter in marginal weather. It was 2 miles from the lookout, across terrain that in daylight and summer was a hard but manageable hike. In the dark, in a blizzard, with one person who couldn't walk without assistance, it was a different calculation entirely. The storm has a break projected between 4 and 5:30 a.m., he said. That's our window for extraction. He checked his watch, roughly 3.5 hours before we need to be at the LZ. He looked at the terrain features he could make out through the windows. 2 miles. This terrain, this weather. With your ankle, we need to leave here no later than 2:30. That gives us 90 minutes for 2 miles. That's slow. That's realistic, he said. There's a section on the northeast traverse where the slope is steep enough that one bad step sends you 30 feet down an ice field. We're going to be careful. Marlowe looked at her wrapped ankle. I can manage. I know you can, he said, but managing isn't the same as doing it alone. I'm going to be next to you the entire way. When the terrain requires it, I'm going to carry you. I need you to not fight me on that when it comes up." She looked like she was going to argue. Then she looked at her ankle again. "Fine," she said, with the tone of someone filing a protest for the record even while conceding the point. "There's one more problem," Cole said. "Of course there is. Damien's contractors are going to figure out we're in this lookout within the next hour. The signal triangulation isn't exact in this weather, but it's close enough. When they do, they're going to move up the mountain." He looked at the northeast window. "We need to be gone before they get here, and we need to move in a direction they won't anticipate." "Which direction will they expect us to go?" "Down. Everyone goes down when they're trying to get off a mountain. Down is roads, warmth, people. Down is rational." He looked up the slope. "We're going up and across." Marlowe absorbed that. "And if they follow us anyway?" The northeast traverse in these conditions is technical enough that 2 men without mountain equipment are going to have a very hard time following quickly. He paused. "I'm counting on that, but not certain." "No," he said. "Not certain." She nodded slowly. "You keep saying that. Not certain, 90%, not exact." She tilted her head slightly. Most people in high-pressure situations oversell their confidence. "Why don't you?" Cole thought about that for a moment. "Because I learned it costs more than it saves," he said. In the teams, the thing that got people hurt wasn't the unknown risks. It was the certainty that someone brought into a situation that turned out to be wrong. If I tell you I'm certain and then I'm wrong, you've made decisions based on a lie I told you. He shrugged slightly. "I'd rather you know the actual odds." Marlowe was quiet for a moment. "Your wife," she said. "How did she die?" The question landed unexpectedly, and Cole looked at her. She held his gaze without apology. She'd asked it directly, and she wasn't going to walk it back. "Aneurysm," he said. No warning. She was 31. He said it the way you say something you've said enough times that the saying of it doesn't undo you anymore, even though the thing itself still does, sometimes in the wrong kind of quiet. "I was on deployment. I got back 4 days after the funeral because extraction was delayed." He paused. "Sadie doesn't remember much of that time. I think that's better." "I'm sorry," Marlowe said. No elaboration. No attempt to find the silver lining or locate the lesson. Just the 2 words, which was the right answer. "Yeah," he said. "Me too." He turned back to the radio and switched it fully off, not standby, off to reduce any remaining signal output. Then he began going through the supply cabinet methodically, taking what would be useful for the traverse and leaving what wouldn't. 2 foil blankets, he folded them tight and distributed 1 to each of them. The hand-crank lantern was too heavy to be worth carrying. He took the first aid kit and reduced its contents to the essentials, the remaining elastic bandage, the small packet of pain tablets, a space blanket, and 2 chemical heat packs that would last about 40 minutes each. He gave Marlowe the heat packs. "Keep those inside your jacket against your core. Not your ankle, don't put heat on that swelling." She took them without argument. "Eat something," he said, finding the freeze-dried rations. He didn't have a way to reconstitute them without water, but the caloric content was still present, and in cold conditions your body burned fuel at a rate that would undercut your judgment before you noticed. "It won't taste like anything." "It doesn't need to taste like anything," she said, and took the packet. While she ate, he stood at the northeast window and studied the terrain as carefully as he could in the dark and weather. The slope dropped away from the lookout in a series of steps, rocky shelves covered in snow, with bands of timber between them. The traverse route he was planning would take them across 3 of those shelves, moving northeast and upward at the same time, before they crested a secondary ridgeline and began the descent to the LZ shoulder on the far side. He'd never done it in winter. He'd hiked the summer version once and done a partial traverse in early October on the search and rescue consult. The topography was clear in his mind, but topography in memory and topography underfoot at 2 a.m. in a blizzard were 2 different things, and he knew it. He thought about Sadie. He thought about her asleep in the house at the edge of town, with the tree line right outside her window that she complained about sometimes because the branches scraped the glass in heavy wind and it woke her up. He thought about the fact that she'd told him last week she was writing a story for school about a girl who could talk to weather systems and negotiate with them to make them behave. He thought about how she'd told him that with complete seriousness, without any self-consciousness at all, and how it had made him feel like the richest man in any room he'd ever been in. He turned away from the window. "Are you ready?" he asked Marlowe. She was on her feet, the thermal layer redistributed under her blazer. One of his gloves on her right hand, he'd given her one, kept one, because her hands were smaller and the cold would get her fingers faster than his. I have been for 10 minutes, she said. He looked at her. Her ankle was wrapped, her jaw was set, her eyes were clear. She'd eaten something she couldn't taste. She'd processed a threat against a man's child without flinching in the direction of surrender, and she was standing upright on a mountain in the middle of the night in dress slacks, waiting for him to open the door. Okay, he said. Stay tight to me on the first section. The stairs are going to be iced. He opened the cab door, and the storm came in like a living thing, cold and immediate and completely indifferent to either of them. He went first down the ice stairs, one hand on the rail, and reached back for her at each landing. She came down carefully, her injured foot taking partial weight and no more, and by the time they reached the ground, her breathing was already controlled and deliberate, the slow intake and release of someone managing pain with conscious effort. They moved into the dark. Behind them, below, and to the southwest, Cole heard an engine rev sharply, a vehicle accelerating uphill. They'd figured out the lookout. He put his arm under Marlowe's, and they moved northeast into the trees, and the storm closed behind them like a curtain. And the mountain held them both in the particular way that wild places hold people who have no other options with complete neutrality and absolute consequence. Somewhere in the dark below, he could hear the engine. It was still climbing, and Cole moved faster, his old training settling around him the way familiar weight always does, not comfortable, not welcome, but known. He'd carried people out of worse places than this. He just hadn't done it in 6 years, and the last time he'd had a team. The first shelf of the traverse was the most exposed 140 feet of open slope between the tree line below the lookout and the timber band above. Nothing on it but wind-scored snow and the occasional boulder pushing through the surface like the crown of something buried. Cole had looked at it from the cab window and made his calculation, 40 seconds of exposure if they moved well, closer to a minute if Marlowe's ankle gave her trouble on the uneven surface. It gave her trouble on the uneven surface. She didn't say anything about it. He felt it in the way her weight shifted against him, the half-second hesitation, each time her right foot came down, the slight overcorrection in her hip that told him the ankle was absorbing less load than it should, and the surrounding muscles were compensating in a way that would cost her later in the climb. He adjusted his grip on her arm, moving his hand from her forearm to her upper arm, where he could take more of her weight without either of them having to acknowledge it explicitly. They crossed the open shelf in 53 seconds. He counted. The timber above was denser than it had looked from the lookout. Young, fir packed close together, their lower branches interlocked at chest height so that moving through them was a matter of pushing and ducking in alternation. The snow was lighter under the canopy, the wind almost entirely blocked, and for the first 40 yards it felt almost manageable. Then the slope tilted upward at a serious angle, and manageable became a different word entirely. "Stop for a second," Cole said. They stopped. Marlowe was breathing through her mouth, controlled but working, and when he looked at her face in the darkness, her jaw was set in the particular way of someone using pain tolerance as a kind of fuel. It worked. He'd seen it work in people under far worse conditions, but it had a burn rate, and the burn rate was not infinite. He looked up the slope. The secondary ridgeline they needed to crest was still 1.25 miles away, maybe more. The LZ was on the far side of that ridge, another 3/4 mile across the shoulder. He did the math against the time they had left and the pace they were actually making, and the math was not comfortable. It wasn't impossible, but it wasn't comfortable. "How's the ankle?" he asked. "Functioning," she said. "That's not what I asked." She looked at him sideways. "It's bad enough that I want to sit down and good enough that I'm not going to." "Is that specific enough?" "Yeah," he said. "That works." They kept moving. Behind them, below the lookout, he could hear voices. Not words. The wind and distance broke speech into syllables before it reached him, but the rhythm of two people communicating while moving, the call and response pattern of a search. They'd found the lookout, found it empty, and were now working the perimeter looking for tracks. The snow was covering tracks faster than they were making them, which was good. The snow was also reducing visibility to about 30 feet in the open, which meant Cole was navigating by memory and terrain instinct rather than by sight, which was a different kind of pressure. He'd done it before. He'd done it in places where the cost of a navigation error was considerably higher than it was here, but the internal experience of trusting your feet and your mental map over your eyes didn't get easier with repetition. You just got better at not flinching away from it. He found the second shelf by feel, the slope leveling suddenly underfoot, the change in the way the wind moved across the surface. He stopped them at the edge of the timber and looked out across the open ground. This shelf was narrower but steeper at its downhill edge, a 12-foot drop onto ice-covered rock that neither of them would survive without serious injury if they went over it. Cole moved them to the left, tracking along the timber edge until he found the place where the drop diminished to about 3 feet, and the rock below was buried under enough snow to be less catastrophic. "We're going across this section," he said, "and we stay about 10 feet from the edge. Don't look down on the right side." "I wasn't planning to," she said. "People always plan not to," he said. "Then they do it anyway." "I am not most people," she said, and said it without particular pride, just as a statement of operational fact. He believed her. "Okay, 10 feet from the edge. Let's go." They were halfway across the second shelf when the flashlight beams appeared below them. 2 of them, sweeping up the slope from the timber band under the lookout. Moving quickly for men, working in the dark on steep ground, these weren't casual searchers. They were working the problem efficiently, which confirmed what Cole had suspected since the cabin. These were trained contractors, not hired muscle. The distinction mattered. Hired muscle stumbled around and made noise. Trained contractors moved with purpose and triangulated correctly and did not give up when the obvious route didn't work. "They're moving faster than I expected," Marlowe said. She'd seen the lights too. "They have equipment. Probably microspikes or light crampons. They came prepared for mountain terrain." Cole watched the angle of the beams. "They're not following our tracks. They can't in this snow. They're grid-searching the slope, which means they'll cover this section eventually." "Yes." "How long?" He watched the movement pattern. 12 minutes before they reach the second shelf at the rate they're moving. "Maybe 15 if the slope gives them trouble above the first timber band." He paused. "We need to be over the ridge before that." "Then stop explaining and move," she said. They moved. The section between the second shelf and the ridgeline was the part Cole had been thinking about since they'd left the lookout. In his summer memory of the traverse, it was a sustained steep climb through open terrain, no real technical difficulty. Just elevation gained quickly against a slope that leaned hard into you and demanded that your legs produce without complaint. In summer, in daylight, without a partially incapacitated person beside him. In current conditions, it was something else. The snow on the upper slope was wind-packed into a surface that was hard in some places and gave way unpredictably in others, so that each step either held your weight or sank you to mid-thigh without warning. Cole went first, testing each foot placement, then reached back for Marlowe and guided her to the spots that held. It was slow, slower than he'd planned for. The wind at this elevation was coming from the northwest at what he estimated was 35 miles an hour, gusting higher, and it hit them broadside and wanted to push them laterally across the slope toward the downhill edge. He put his body between her and the wind and kept moving. "You're blocking the wind," she said at one point. "Yes, you've been doing that the whole time. Yes. You didn't ask me if I wanted that." He kept moving. "You needed it." Asking seemed like wasted time. She was quiet for a moment, working through a thigh-deep section where the snow had drifted against a rock feature. He took her arm and pulled, and she came through it, and when she did, she was breathing very hard, and her face was tight with exertion and cold. "Thank you," she said, when she had enough breath for it. He didn't say you're welcome. He said 100 yards to the ridgeline and kept climbing. The 100 yards took 22 minutes. He knew because he checked his watch at the base of the final pitch, and again when they crested the ridgeline and dropped into the lee of it, out of the wind for the first time since leaving the lookout. Marlowe leaned against the rock surface of the ridge crest, and he let her because her ankle had been taking more load in the final pitch than was reasonable, and the muscles around it were now shaking in the way of an overloaded system. He crouched beside her and looked back down the slope they'd come up. The flashlight beams were on the second shelf. Both of them, moving across it in the direction they'd come from, not missing much. 9 minutes, maybe 10, before they reached the base of the final pitch. At their current pace, Cole and Marlowe could not reach the LZ before the contractors crested the ridge behind them. He stood up and looked at the shoulder on the far side, a gentler descent through scattered timber, opening onto the flat ground of the LZ. In the dark, he couldn't see the LZ itself, but he knew its position relative to the ridgeline, and he knew the terrain between. 3/4 of a mile of descent, significantly easier going than the climb they'd just done. The problem was the pace. He looked at Marlowe. She was standing, one hand against the rock, her weight on her left foot. Her ankle had gone past the point where willpower was the main variable. He could see it in the way she was holding her legs slightly bent at the knee, the foot positioned to keep weight off the lateral side where the swelling was worst. It wasn't a posture you adopted from preference. It was the posture your body arrived at when it was protecting something that could not take much more. "I'm going to carry you for the descent section," he said. She opened her mouth. "Not the whole way," he said. "The first half, where the slope is steepest and the most ground sensitive. When we hit the flat approach to the LZ, I'll put you down." "Cole, I can do it faster than we've been going," he said. "I know how this sounds. I'm not trying to make a point about anything. I'm trying to get us to that LZ before those two men crest the ridge behind us. That's the only consideration right now." She looked at him with the expression of someone absorbing a fact they didn't like and weren't going to pretend to like. "You're certain this is faster?" "For the descent section, with your ankle in the current condition, yes. Significantly faster." A pause. The wind over the ridge crest was audible even in the relative shelter of the lee side, a constant low pressure that filled the silence. "Fine," she said, the same word she'd used at the lookout. The tone of someone entering a concession into the record under protest. He crouched. She got onto his back without making it into anything larger than a logistics problem, and he stood. She wasn't light, she was a full-grown adult, and adult bodies have density that good posture conceals, but he found his balance and adjusted his center of gravity and started moving down the far side of the ridge. His knees knew about it. He was 37, not 24, and the accumulated arithmetic of 6 years of living like a normal person meant that carrying a person down a steep, icy mountain in the dark registered differently in his body than it once had. He felt it in the second mile of his knee joints and the upper hamstrings and the specific place in his lower back that had been complaining since a training fall in 2019. He kept moving. Marlowe said nothing for the first quarter mile, which he appreciated. She kept her weight centered and her movements minimal, which told him she'd thought about how to make herself easier to carry rather than just letting herself be carried. And that told him something about her, that all the other evidence of the night had been building toward that. Underneath the CCO and the board seat and the billion-dollar company was a person who thought about the people around her and tried, in whatever way was available to her, not to add to their burden. He was thinking about that when the slope shifted under his left foot and he went down. Not catastrophically, not the 30-foot slide he'd been careful to route them away from, but a genuine fall, left foot losing purchase on a buried ice patch, his knee hitting the slope hard, and his body's automatic response rotating them to the right, so that when they hit the snow it was his shoulder and not her that took the impact. They slid 4 feet before a rock caught them and stopped the slide, and Cole was up on one knee before Marlowe had fully processed what had happened. "I'm fine," she said immediately. "Are you?" "I'm fine." His left knee was unhappy. He tested weight on it, it held. A 7 out of 10, not pleasant but functional. The shoulder that had taken the impact was going to be stiff and bruised in the morning. He stood up. "You took the fall on purpose," she said. "You rotated us." "Yes, that's going to hurt tomorrow." "Probably." He crouched again. "Get back on." She looked at him for a moment in the dark, and he couldn't fully read her expression in the limited light, but he could read the quality of the silence. Then she got back on, without another word, and he stood again and kept moving. They reached the flat approach to the LZ shoulder at 3:51 a.m. He put her down, and they both stood in the relative shelter of the last timber band and looked out across the clearing. It was maybe 200 yards across a long oval of flat mountain ground, snow-covered, the irregular shapes of old survey markers visible at the edges where the wind had scoured down to the post tops. It was empty, no helicopter, no lights, no movement. Marlowe didn't say anything. He could feel the quality of her stillness beside him, not panic, but the controlled flatness of someone who has prepared themselves for disappointment, and is now holding very still while they assess whether this is it. Cole checked his watch. 3:52 a.m. The window was 4 to 5:30. "We're 8 minutes early," he said. "I know that," she said quietly. They stood at the timber edge and waited, and the mountain around them was a whole large silence, broken only by wind, and the sound of their own breathing, and, somewhere behind them and above them, the occasional distant crack of timber shifting under ice load. Cole turned and looked back up the slope. He could see the ridgeline as a dark line against the slightly lighter dark of the sky. No flashlight beams visible yet. But the contractors had been on the second shelf when they'd crested, and they'd had 8 minutes since then. He looked back at the LZ. Still empty, he looked at his watch. 3:57. He thought about Silas Varden. He thought about the 4 years they'd operated together, the kind of professional intimacy that comes from being in genuinely terrible situations with someone long enough that their decision-making becomes familiar to you, almost predictable, the way a good mechanic knows an engine well enough to anticipate where it's going to need attention before it tells you. Silas was not the kind of man who said he would be somewhere at a specific time and then wasn't. He was also not the kind of man who flew into a mountain LZ in a winter storm without doing his homework on the weather window. If Silas said 4 a.m., he meant 4 a.m. Cole looked at his watch. 3:59. Marlowe put her hand on his arm, not asking anything, just the physical presence of another person who was also waiting. He felt the vibration through the snow before he heard it. It was subtle, the kind of transmitted vibration that a rotor system puts into the ground when it's still a mile out, a low-frequency pulse that moved up through his boots and into his legs before his ears picked up the sound. He knew it the way you know a thing that's been part of your working life for over a decade. His body recognized it before his mind confirmed it. "There," he said. Marlowe turned. "I don't hear." And then she did. The sound built from nothing to unmistakable. In about 15 seconds, the overlapping thump of main rotor and tail rotor, coming through a gap in the ridge to the east, the navigation lights appearing low and fast, the aircraft dropping into the valley approach with the specific no-nonsense trajectory of a pilot who knew exactly where he was going and was not sightseeing on the way. The helicopter came across the clearing at about 40 feet and flared hard, the rotor wash hitting them even at the timber edge, blasting snow into a horizontal white wall. It was a military search and rescue configuration, a medium-lift rotary with the crew door already open on the port side, a figure visible in the opening with a harness on. It touched down. Not elegantly, the left skid hit first, and the aircraft rocked and corrected and settled, and it was the controlled, slightly imperfect contact of a pilot working a high-altitude LZ in marginal weather rather than the smooth touchdown of a demonstration flight. And Cole found that imperfection deeply reassuring in a way that a perfect landing would not have been. This was real. He had his arm around Marlowe, and they were moving before the skids fully settled, crossing the clearing in the direct line, the rotor wash making walking feel like pushing through something solid. Marlowe was limping hard and fast with her head down and her jaw set, and Cole matched her pace and kept his hand at her back. They were 60 yards from the aircraft when he heard the shout behind them. He didn't look back. He knew from the volume and direction that the contractors had crested the ridge and were in the timber above the clearing. He put his hand more firmly on Marlowe's back, and they kept moving. 40 yards. 30. The figure in the open crew door was reaching toward them, and Cole recognized Silas Varden's particular way of moving, the economical, zero-wasted motion quality that some people developed after long enough working in spaces where excess movement had consequence. Silas was 51 and had retired his operator status 4 years ago, but clearly hadn't lost the physicality. 20 yards. Cole heard something hit the snow to their left. Not a gunshot they weren't shooting, not with a military aircraft on the ground, and witnesses aboard. It was a thrown object, maybe a radio, maybe a frustration thrown in the specific way of men who were realizing the thing they'd been chasing for 8 hours was 15 seconds from leaving. 10 yards. Silas Varden grabbed Marlowe's arm and pulled her aboard with the practiced efficiency of a man who had done that motion in real conditions and understood that the time for being careful about it was not when the aircraft was on a hot LZ. Cole came up the step behind her, his hand finding the grab rail, and he was aboard and pulling the door closed before his feet had fully cleared the ground. The pilot didn't wait. The aircraft lifted immediately, the nose pitching forward, the LZ falling away beneath them, as the helicopter accelerated across the clearing and over the ridge and into the valley beyond. The whole process from landing to departure had taken 43 seconds. Cole sat on the floor of the crew compartment with his back against the bulkhead and breathed. Marlowe was across from him, her injured leg extended, both hands flat on the deck. She was looking at him. Her hair was full of snow, and her blazer was torn at the left shoulder seam from the section of climb where she'd pushed through a dense stand of young pine, and her face was wind-burned and exhausted and completely alive in the way of someone who has just crossed the line between one set of consequences and another. Silas crouched between them and looked at Cole with the expression of a man who had known Cole Stratham for a long time and was currently deciding how he felt about being woken up before midnight for a mountain extraction in a winter storm. "You look terrible," Silas said. "You look late," Cole said. "I was exactly on time." 8 minutes and 20 seconds after 4, Cole said. I counted. Silas looked at Marlowe. "Is he always like this?" I've only known him for one night, she said, but I'm already fairly confident the answer is yes. Silas almost smiled. He handed them both a foil blanket and a water bottle and stood up, moving back toward the cockpit with the rolling ease of a man comfortable in aircraft. Over his shoulder, he said, I've got deputies on the lower mountain road per the coordination I ran through the county sheriff. The two gentlemen on the slope are going to have a very boring morning. Cole leaned his head back against the bulkhead and closed his eyes for approximately 4 seconds. Then he opened them, because closing them felt too close to letting go of something he wasn't ready to let go of yet. Marlowe was still looking at him. Your knee, she said, from the fall. It's fine. You're not bending it all the way. It'll loosen up. She held his gaze. Cole, it's all right to be hurt. You're allowed. He looked at her for a moment. I know that, he said. You don't act like it. He thought about that. He thought about the years after his wife died when he'd operated on the principle that feeling things took time away from doing the things that needed to be done, and how that principle had worked right up until Sadie was 7 and had a nightmare and came into his room at 2 a.m. and found him sitting at the kitchen table doing nothing at all, just sitting in the dark in the house, and had climbed into his lap without a word and fallen back asleep there, and he'd sat with her and understood for the first time that the doing wasn't the same as the being present, and one of them was not a substitute for the other. Old habit, he said. She seemed to understand that that was the whole answer. The helicopter banked east, and below them the lights of Red Hollow appeared through a break in the cloud cover, the loose scatter of a small mountain town. The amber streetlights along the 2 main roads, the darker residential edges where people were sleeping in their houses. Cole looked for the edge of town where the tree line began. He thought about an 11-year-old girl, asleep in a house where the branches scraped the window, who was writing a story about negotiating with weather systems, who had no idea that her father had just come off a mountain in a military helicopter at 4 a.m. She would have opinions about that. Strong opinions, delivered over breakfast with the absolute confidence of someone who had not yet learned to filter her reactions for an audience. He was looking forward to it more than he could say. Marlowe spoke quietly under the engine noise. What's the board meeting start time? 8 a.m., he said. She was looking at the lights below. Her jaw had relaxed for the first time all night, the tension in it replaced by something that wasn't quite relief and wasn't quite resolve, but sat somewhere between the two. We land, go straight to the hospital for the ankle, and then, you're not going to a board meeting from a mountain extraction, without having your ankle imaged, he said. I know that, I said hospital first. She paused. Then the meeting. Cole looked at her. The woman who had been lying half-conscious on a cold cabin floor 8 hours ago was still sitting there somewhere in the exhaustion, in the windburn, in the torn blazer, in the wrapped ankle and the snow in her hair. But what was also in there, sitting alongside the exhaustion without displacing it, was the specific kind of steadiness that comes not from the absence of fear, but from having moved through it and come out the other side, knowing something you didn't know before. You really intend to walk into that boardroom, he said. I intend to limp into that boardroom, she said. There's a difference. But yes. Cole looked at the lights below for a moment. He reached into his inside pocket and felt the flash drive still there, still solid, unchanged by the entire night. Then he checked his watch, 3 hours and 51 minutes. More than enough, she said. She said it with the conviction of someone who had just crossed 2 miles of mountain terrain in a blizzard on a broken ankle and had updated their baseline for what enough looked like. Below them, Red Hollow grew closer, the lights sharpening as the helicopter descended, and the mountain they'd come off of disappeared behind the ridge into the dark. Somewhere on its slopes, 2 men were working their way down toward a road where county deputies were waiting. And the morning was still 2 hours from showing itself, and everything that happened next would happen in buildings with fluorescent lights and conference tables, and people in suits. Cole thought that would probably be harder in its own way than the mountain. He thought Marlowe could handle it. He thought, and the thought surprised him with its clarity, that he was glad it was her and not someone else. The hospital in Red Hollow was a small regional facility, 22 beds, 1 emergency physician on overnight rotation, and a radiology technician who had to be called in from home when the X-ray unit was needed outside of standard hours. The technician arrived at 4:20 in the morning with his coat half-buttoned and coffee in a travel mug, and he did his job without complaint, which Cole respected. The imaging confirmed what both of them had already known on the mountain, a lateral malleolus fracture, incomplete, with significant ligament involvement on the outside of the ankle joint. The emergency physician, a compact, precise woman named Dr. Reyes, who had clearly seen enough unusual presentations in a rural ER that 2 frostburned people arriving by military helicopter at 4 a.m. registered as merely notable rather than shocking, fitted Marlowe with a walking boot, gave her a brief lecture on weight-bearing limits that Marlowe listened to with the patient expression of someone who had already decided how much of it she intended to follow, and prescribed anti-inflammatory medication and a follow-up with an orthopedic specialist. You should not be walking on this for any significant distance for at least 72 hours, Doctor. Reyes said. I understand, Marlowe said. Dr. Reyes looked at her with the specific expression of a clinician who has been told I understand enough times to know what it does and doesn't mean. You're going to walk on it anyway. I have a meeting at 8 a.m. Dr. Reyes looked at Cole. He held up both hands slightly, the universal gesture of a person who has already tried. The boot will provide structural support, Dr. Reyes said, returning to Marlowe. Take the medication now, before the adrenaline wears off completely, or the pain in about 2 hours is going to be considerably more persuasive than anything I've said. Marlowe took the medication. Cole's knee was examined at his own request, Doctor. Reyes confirmed what he'd suspected, a mild MCL strain and deep contusion from the fall on the icy slope. Nothing structural, nothing that wouldn't resolve in a week with ice and rest. She wrapped it, told him to avoid stairs where possible, and looked at his face when she said it with enough directness that he understood. She knew stairs were probably not the main thing he was planning to avoid. Thank you, he said. Try to sleep at some point, she said. Both of you. She said it without particular expectation. Silas Varden was waiting in the corridor when Cole came out. He was leaning against the wall, with his arms crossed, and the expression of a man who had done the polite thing by waiting, and was now done being polite about the waiting. County Sheriff has the 2 contractors, he said. They came down the mountain at first light and walked into the deputies the way Silas said they would, cold, tired, and without a very good story about what they'd been doing on a gated mountain road during a winter storm. He paused. They're not talking yet, but they had encrypted phones and contractor documentation that's going to take about 4 hours to unpack and about 4 minutes to connect to something larger. Damien Rusk, Cole said. That would be my guess. Silas looked at him steadily. You going to tell me the full version of what happened tonight? Yes, Cole said later. Silas accepted that because he knew Cole well enough to know that later was a real word and not a deflection. The helicopter's refueling at the county airfield. My pilot's getting breakfast. I've got until 10 a.m. before I need to have the aircraft back, and a report filed that explains why I ran an extraction on a civilian LZ in the middle of a storm without formal authorization. What's your report going to say? That I received a verified legacy distress call from a known operator requesting personnel recovery assistance, that civilian lives were at immediate risk, and that the weather window was narrow enough that waiting for formal authorization would have resulted in mission failure. Silas paused. It's all true. It's all true, Cole agreed. Silas looked at him for a moment with the expression of someone who has something to say and is deciding whether the moment is right for it. Then he said, You know they would have taken you back. After Laura died. The teams. You had standing offers for 3 years. I know, Cole said. I'm not saying you made the wrong choice, Silas said. He stopped. Started again. Tonight you did what you were trained to do, and you did it alone. Without a team, without equipment, without anything except what you had on you. And it worked. He looked at Cole directly. I just want you to know that I noticed. Cole was quiet for a moment. In the corridor of a small hospital at 4:45 in the morning, with his knee wrapped and his shoulder aching and his hands still carrying the residual cold of the mountain, he thought about what to do with that. I know you noticed, he said. Thank you, Silas. Silas nodded once, the way men who have operated together nod when a thing has been said and doesn't need to be expanded. Go do whatever comes next, he said. I'll be at the airfield until 10. He walked down the corridor, and Cole watched him go, and felt the particular weight of shared history that you carry with certain people, not heavy, exactly, but present. Real in the way that only things earned over time become real. Marlowe was in a curtained bay making a phone call when Cole came back. She'd found a phone borrowed from a nurse or commandeered one from the hospital's front desk. He wasn't sure which, and she was speaking in the low, precise voice of someone delivering high-density information to someone on the other end who needed to act on it immediately. He waited outside the curtain. He could hear fragments, the name of the company's general counsel, the words independent auditor and federal contact and board secretary. The phrase "the drive is intact" repeated twice for emphasis. And once, quietly, the words "Damien doesn't know how much time he's already lost." She came out 7 minutes later and handed him a paper cup of coffee that someone had brought her and that she apparently hadn't touched. She looked at his face and then handed him the coffee without comment, which was the right call because he needed it and both of them knew it. "My legal counsel is already moving," she said. "We have 2 independent forensic auditors who've been on standby for this audit. For the past 6 weeks I engaged them privately after Wesley first contacted me, before I knew exactly what I was dealing with. They've been sitting on their hands waiting for authorization and material." She paused. "I'm authorizing them now. They'll be at the meeting. And federal investigators. My counsel is making that contact this morning. The flash drive is what opens that door." She looked at it in his hand. He'd taken it out of his pocket in the hospital and held it there, this small rectangular piece of plastic and metal that had generated 8 hours of a Montana winter mountain in the dark. "The drive alone is documentation. But Damien's operation to keep me off the mountain, the advanced security contracts, the helicopter records if they can be traced, the cabin rental, the vehicle blocking the road, the radio contact he made directly to me, that's a documented chain of conduct that corroborates everything on the drive, and then some." Her voice was precise, but there was something underneath it, not triumph, more like exhaustion meeting clarity. He was so focused on what he needed to do that he built a record of himself doing it. Cole turned the drive over in his hand once, then gave it to her. "It's yours." She took it and closed her hand around it. "Thank you," she said, and it carried more weight than 2 words usually do, which they both understood, and neither of them made larger than it was. "What time is it?" she asked. 4:58. 3 hours, she said. "I need a phone that's actually mine, a change of clothes, and a car." "I can get you a car," he said. "Red Hollow's small enough that I know everyone at the 2 rental places, and both of them will have someone I can call at 5 a.m. who will actually answer." He paused. "Clothes are harder. The hospital has a small gift shop," she said. "It opens at 6. "I've already looked." He almost laughed. "Of course you have. I'm not walking into a board meeting in a torn blazer," she said. "Whatever the gift shop has is better than that. Their inventory tends toward fleece pullovers with the hospital logo and novelty socks," he said. She looked at him. "Then I'm walking into a board meeting in a fleece pullover and novelty socks and a medical walking boot, and Damien Rusk is going to look at me from across that table and understand exactly how much he failed last night." Cole looked at her for a moment. This woman, who 24 hours ago had been a name on financial news he'd never read, who had become in the space of one night something considerably more specific and harder to categorize. Imperfect in the ways that people are when the situation strips the professional performance away and leaves just the person underneath capable of fear, capable of the wrong impulse toward surrender when someone mentioned a child, capable of trying to give back control to a man on a radio in a moment of exhaustion, and also capable of getting back up from all of it and continuing to move when continuing to move was the hardest available option. "Okay," he said. "I'll make the call about the car." He stepped outside to use the hospital's courtesy phone at the front desk, and while he was waiting for the call to connect, he looked out the front window at Red Hollow in the particular quality of light that belongs to the hour just before dawn in a mountain town after a heavy storm. The snow had stopped. The streets were white and untracked, and the air had the clean, stripped quality of a morning that hadn't been breathed yet. The mountains were invisible behind cloud, but their presence was implied by the way the sky sat slightly compressed, slightly closer, the way it gets when there's a lot of elevation nearby. He thought about Sadie. She would be waking up in about 2 hours. On a school day, she was reliable alarm set for 6:30, out of bed by 6:40 cereal and whatever fruit they had by 7, out the door by 7:45. She would come downstairs and find the house empty, and his truck not in the drive, and she would feel something that he didn't like to think about too directly, because Sadie had been managing the anxiety of having only one parent for 6 years, with a practicality that was both admirable and the kind of thing that occasionally broke your heart if you looked at it too squarely. He needed to call her. He arranged the car. First, Frank DeLuca at Red Hollow Rentals answered on the 3rd ring, with the voice of a man who had been awake for a while, and when Cole explained the situation in the abbreviated, practical terms of someone who needed a favor and not a conversation, Frank said he'd have something at the hospital lot by 7, and he'd leave the keys at the front desk. Then Cole called his own house. Sadie answered on the 2nd ring, which meant she'd been awake. Gad. Her voice had the specific quality of a child who has been sitting with quiet worry and is now releasing it. "Where are you?" "Hospital," he said. "I'm fine. I had a situation last night that kept me out. I should have called sooner, if I'm sorry." "Are you actually fine, or are you saying you're fine?" He looked down at his wrapped knee. "I have a minor knee injury and I'm tired. Everything else is okay." A pause. "What kind of situation?" "The kind I'll explain at dinner tonight. Are you okay?" "I've been up since 4, she said, with the resigned honesty of someone who'd tried to sleep and given up. "I made toast." "Good call," he said. "I'll be home before noon. I have to help someone with something first." Another pause, longer. Sadie had a quality of silence that she'd had since she was very small, a listening silence. Not an empty one, the silence of a person actually processing what they were hearing rather than just waiting to respond. She'd gotten it from her mother, who had the same quality, and it was one of the things that sometimes moved through Cole sideways when he wasn't prepared for it. "Is the someone okay?" Sadie asked. "She's going to be." "Okay," Sadie said. And then, with the particular pragmatic grace of an 11-year-old who has decided that worrying further isn't useful, "There's leftover chili in the fridge if you're hungry when you get home." "That sounds perfect," he said. "Dad? Yeah. Next time call me." "Yes," he said. "You're right, I will." He hung up and stood at the front desk for a moment with his hand on the phone, and the specific feeling that moved through him then wasn't guilt exactly, and wasn't relief exactly, and wasn't the particular ache of missing someone who was only 2 miles away exactly. It was something that contained all of those things without being reducible to any of them. Parenthood had a texture that nothing in his previous life had prepared him for, not the teams, not the deployments, not even the grief. It was its own territory, with its own weather and its own demands, and he had been learning it for 6 years, and he suspected he would be learning it for the rest of his life. He went back to find Marlowe at 7:15 a.m., Frank DeLuca's rental car, a gray 4-door sedan that smelled faintly of pine air freshener and had 40,000 miles on it, pulled out of the hospital lot with Marlowe in the passenger seat, wearing a navy blue hospital gift shop fleece. Pullover over her dress slacks, her walking boot extended toward the footwell, and the flash drive in the inside pocket of the fleece where a chest pocket had been stitched. Cole drove. She'd managed to reach her assistant by phone, and her assistant had spent the intervening hours with the efficiency of someone who understood that their employer's situation was extraordinary, and that ordinary responses to extraordinary situations were a form of failure. The board secretary had been notified. The independent auditors were en route from Missoula. The general counsel had made 2 calls that would result in federal investigators being present at, or shortly after, the meeting's opening. And Damian Rusk, who had presumably spent the hours since his radio contact, believing he was still managing the situation, had not yet been informed of any of it. Cole thought about Damian on the drive. Not with anger. Anger was a form of attention he didn't want to give the man, but with the professional curiosity of someone trying to understand the architecture of a failure. Because that's what last night had been for Damian. Not a bold play that almost worked, but a fundamental miscalculation about the nature of the thing he was trying to control. He'd built an operation around the assumption that Marlowe Kessler, alone on a mountain in a storm, was a manageable variable. He'd treated her as the only piece that needed to be moved. He hadn't accounted for a fallen tree across a county road bothering a mechanic on his way home. Most catastrophic failures, Cole had found, came down to something that small. Not the grand miscalculation, the overlooked detail, the variable that wasn't in the model because no one thought it needed to be. "You're thinking about something," Marlowe said. "Damian's mistake," he said. "Which one?" "The foundational one," Cole said. He planned around everything he could see. He didn't plan for things he couldn't anticipate because he didn't think they were relevant. Marlowe was quiet for a moment. "Me," she said. "He didn't plan for me surviving the night." "He planned for you surviving," Cole said. "He just planned for you surviving alone." He kept his eyes on the road, the early morning highway still slick in the shaded sections. "You weren't alone." She looked out the window at the passing landscape, the mountains just beginning to emerge from the cloud cover as the storm system moved east, the peaks showing themselves in sections, white and massive and indifferent, to everything that had happened on their slopes overnight. "No," she said quietly. The Kessler North Star Regional Office occupied the top 2 floors of a 6-story building in downtown Missoula, 40 minutes from Red Hollow. They arrived at 7:58 a.m. Cole pulled into the parking structure and found a space and turned off the engine, and they sat for a moment in the quiet of the car. Marlowe looked at the entrance to the building. Then she looked at Cole. You don't have to come in, she said. I know. This part isn't yours to carry. I know that too. He paused. But I'd like to see it through, if that's all right. She looked at him for a moment, with the expression of someone receiving something they didn't ask for and aren't entirely sure how to hold. All right, she said. They went in. The lobby security guards stared at them, the fleece pullover, the walking boot, the exhausted, wind-burned faces, and said nothing. Because Marlowe walked through the lobby the way she apparently walked through every room, as though the question of whether she belonged there had been settled before she arrived and didn't require revisiting. The elevator, the top floor, a corridor with the particular quality of expensive corporate quiet good carpet, recessed lighting, the faint sound of a meeting already in session behind closed double doors at the far end. Marlowe stopped outside the doors, straightened the fleece pullover with a gesture that was almost funny, except that it wasn't, because what it actually was a person locating their composure in the only adjustment available to them at that moment. Cole stood beside her. Ready? No, she said. Let's go. She opened the doors. The boardroom held 14 people around a long table, with additional chairs along the walls occupied by legal counsel and administrative staff. At the head of the table, in the chair that should have been Marlowe's, Damien Rusk sat with his hands flat on the table's surface, and the expression of a man who had just watched a certainty become a question. The room went completely silent. Damien's face moved through several things in about 2 seconds. Surprise genuine, unguarded, the surprise of a man who had received reports through the night that the situation was contained and is now looking at evidence that it was not. Then calculation. Cole could see it, the rapid internal assessment of options and positions. And then, underneath both of those, something that wasn't quite fear, but was its immediate neighbor. Marlowe walked to the head of the table. Her boot made a distinctive sound on the hardwood floor, beyond the carpet a firm, deliberate rhythm that did not accommodate apology. She sat down. She put the flash drive on the table. She looked at Damien Rusk with the clear, even gaze of someone who has spent a night on a mountain and come down from it knowing exactly who she is and what she's doing in this room. I'd like to call this meeting to order, she said. We're 11 minutes late, and I apologize for that. I was unavoidably detained. Nobody laughed. Nobody was going to laugh. But 3 or 4 people around the table shifted in their seats with the particular micro-movement of people releasing tension they'd been holding without knowing it. Damien, said Marlowe. His voice was careful. We were concerned about you. There were reports of a storm. There was a storm, she said. There was also a cut fuel line, a disconnected radio antenna, a vehicle trap on the access road, and 2 contractors in search and rescue clothing who have been in county custody since approximately 5 a.m. this morning. She paused. The sheriff's department has their phones. The room was very still. The flash drive on the table contains financial documentation prepared by Wesley Price, former senior internal auditor, covering a 3-year period of fund movement through shell company infrastructure connected to Kessler Northstar Capital. Marlowe's voice didn't rise or fall. It was the voice of someone reading a prepared statement that they have been composing in their head for the last 3 hours. I have engaged independent forensic auditors. They're in the conference room down the hall, and I have been in contact this morning with federal investigators who will be joining us shortly. She looked at Damien directly. The auditors will need full access to the operational records for the Western Logistics Division going back 38 months. Damien didn't speak. There was nothing to say that wasn't going to make it worse, and he was smart enough to know it, which was perhaps the only intelligent decision he made that morning. The restructuring vote on today's agenda is tabled, pending the completion of the independent audit, Marlowe said. Any board member who wishes to review the documentation on the drive before that audit is complete may do so in the presence of legal counsel. She looked around the room. Are there any questions? There were questions. Many of them from the board members who had arrived expecting a routine, if contentious, meeting and were now sitting in something considerably more complicated. She answered them with the precision of someone who had been preparing for this conversation not just this morning, but for weeks, since Wesley Price's first message, since the routing table discrepancy she'd flagged to Damien, and watched disappear into his careful, competent silence. Damien Rusk said almost nothing for the first 40 minutes. When he finally spoke, it was to request a recess to consult with his personal legal counsel, and it was in the tone of a man who has accepted a situation he cannot reverse and is now concerned with limiting the damage to whatever portion of his future remains negotiable. The recess was granted. He did not return from it. Cole stood along the wall throughout the meeting. He was aware of the looks from legal staff and board members, the windburned man in the back of the room, who was not identified, not introduced, not explained. He didn't mind. He'd spent a significant portion of his adult life being the person in a room that other people in the room didn't officially know about, and the sensation was familiar in a way that was almost comfortable. When the federal investigators arrived at 9:20, and the meeting effectively became something other than a board meeting, Cole quietly left the room and took the elevator back to the lobby and sat in a chair near the entrance and waited. He sat there for a while. He thought about his wife. He thought about Laura the way he'd been thinking about her. More often lately, not with the acute, destabilizing grief of the first years, but with the gentler ache of someone carrying a permanent absence that has been integrated into the shape of daily life without ever becoming smaller. She would have had things to say about last night. She would have had things to say about Marlowe, specific and accurate observations delivered in the dry, affectionate way she'd always had of identifying exactly what something was without making the identification cruel. She would have had things to say about Cole sitting in a corporate lobby at 9 a.m. in a borrowed thermal layer with a wrapped knee, having just come off a mountain. She would have laughed, and then she would have asked whether he was actually all right. And she would have known the difference between the answer he gave and the actual answer, because she always had. He missed her the way you miss someone you loved specifically, not generally. Not the concept of her. Her, he was sitting with that when Marlowe came out. She walked to the chair beside him and sat down, and she sat carefully because of the ankle. And when she was settled, she let out a breath that seemed to have been held since before the mountain, since before the cabin, possibly since before any of this began. "Wesley Price," Cole said. "Do you know yet he's alive?" She said it with the exhale still in her voice. He panicked 2 days before the meeting he was being followed, and he knew it. He hid the drive in my rental car and then went to ground at a cousin's place in Wyoming. He's been unreachable because he turned his phone off. A pause. He's already been contacted by my legal team. He's cooperating. So he's safe, for now. Yes. She paused. He was terrified, Cole. He's not a brave man in the conventional sense. But he prepared that drive, and he hid it, and he held on to what he knew, even when the easier thing would have been to walk away and let it go. She looked at the lobby floor. "I think that counts for something." "It counts for a lot," Cole said. They sat quietly for a moment. "Damien's voting authority is suspended pending the investigation," Marlowe said. "He resigned from the company about 20 minutes ago, which his counsel clearly advised, because it gives him slightly better optics than being removed formally, though it won't change what the investigation finds." She paused. "The restructuring vote is tabled for at least 60 days. By the time it comes back to the table, the board will have a complete picture of what it was designed to do. And the shell companies? That's going to take months to fully unwind. The federal involvement changes the scale of the investigation. Some of this will be very public before it's resolved." She said it without drama, the flat acceptance of someone who understands that the price of doing the right thing is not always the thing ending cleanly. The company will survive it. It'll be difficult and it'll be loud, and there will be coverage that isn't fair, and board members who distance themselves at the wrong moments, and employees who are frightened about their futures. She paused. "But it'll survive. Because you were in that chair at 8 a.m., Cole said. "Because someone found me in a cabin at the right moment," she said. Cole looked at the lobby entrance. The morning light was coming through the glass doors. Now the storm fully gone. The sky outside a washed pale blue. "You would have found another way," he said. "Maybe," she said. "Eventually." "But," she stopped. "There's a version of last night where the storm takes 3 more hours to develop, where the tree across the road holds you up long enough that you decide to go the other way, where I'm still in that cabin at 6 a.m. and I make it out on my own, but I'm too late." She looked at him. "There's that version." "There's that version," he agreed. "I keep thinking about the tree," she said. "About what you said, that it bothered you. Not that it was dangerous, or that it was an obstacle. That it bothered you. The angle was wrong," he said. "Most people don't notice angles," she said. "Most people see a tree across a road and turn around." Cole thought about that. About 11 years of training the part of his brain that read situations for what they were instead of what they appeared to be. About whether that kind of reading ever fully switches off, or whether it just goes quiet, like a frequency that's no longer being broadcast, but is still being monitored. "I noticed a lot of things I didn't want to notice anymore," he said. "I thought moving to Red Hollow would let me stop." He paused. "It mostly did, but not entirely." "No," he said. "Not entirely. Marlowe was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I want to offer you something, and I want you to hear it before you respond. He waited. Kessler Northstar has an executive crisis and field safety division that currently reports to Damien's vacated COO role. It oversees field operations security, crisis response protocols, personnel safety, and remote logistics environments. It needs someone who understands operational risk from the inside out. She looked at him steadily. The compensation is significant. The role is based wherever you choose to be based. It would not require you to leave Red Hollow. Cole was quiet. It's not charity, she said. It's not gratitude wearing a job description. The division is genuinely underdeveloped, and it needs the kind of leadership that I'm not sure I could find through conventional hiring channels. She paused. You would be extraordinary at it. Cole looked at the light coming through the lobby doors. He thought about Frank DeLuca's rental car. He thought about Denny's auto and the bay doors and the particular satisfaction of understanding a mechanical system completely enough to know exactly what it needed and providing it. He thought about Red Hollow in October, when the aspens turned and you could see the color from the edge of town, and about Sadie's school and her Saturday soccer and her story about the girl who negotiated with weather systems. He thought about what it meant to have found the right size for your life and then been offered something larger. No, he said. Marlowe didn't look surprised. He thought she'd known before she asked. It's a real offer, she said. It stands. I know it's real, he said. And I'm not saying no to the offer. I'm saying no because I already know what the answer is. He looked at her. Sadie's 12 next spring. She's writing stories about negotiating with weather systems. She plays soccer on Saturdays, and she makes better chili than I do, and she is the best decision I've ever made. And she needs her father in Red Hollow making it to her Saturday games, not traveling for crisis assessments. He paused. I don't need the money enough to trade that. I don't think I need anything enough to trade that. Marlowe held his gaze. Something moved through her expression, not disappointment, not exactly, but something adjacent to it that was also adjacent to respect. The particular look of someone encountering a choice they don't fully understand, but can recognize as made from a position of real clarity. All right, she said. All right, he agreed. 4 months later, in the middle of March, when the last of the hard snow was retreating up the slopes, the Red Hollow was beginning its slow seasonal exhale, Marlowe Kessler drove a rented car up the 2-lane highway from Missoula and turned onto the county road and found the house at the edge of the tree line without difficulty. She knocked. Cole answered the door in work clothes, a smear of grease on his forearm that he hadn't noticed yet. He looked at her and then past her at the car in the drive and then back at her. You drove up yourself this time, he said. I did, she said. No problems with the road. He stepped back from the door. Come in. She came in, and Sadie was at the kitchen table doing homework with the focused, slightly irritated energies of someone being required to engage with a subject they have complicated feelings about. And she looked up at Marlowe with the frank, unfiltered assessment of a 12-year-old who has not yet learned to disguise initial impressions. You're the CEO, Sadie said. I am, Marlowe said. Dad said you walked into a board meeting in a hospital fleece, Sadie said. I did. Sadie considered this. That's kind of cool, she said, and returned to her homework. Marlowe looked at Cole. He spread his hands slightly. This is who she is. They sat at the kitchen table after Sadie finished her homework and went outside with the careful disregard for adult conversation that children deploy when they're actually listening very carefully from a distance. Cole made coffee and Marlowe put something on the table that she'd carried in from the car. It was the emergency radio from the fire lookout. Restored, not factory refurbished, but carefully repaired, every component cleaned and serviced, the housing repainted a flat gray that was close to its original color. The antenna cable was new. The county agreed to replace the lookout unit with a modern system, she said. I asked if I could have the old one. Cole looked at it. He reached out and touched the antenna terminal, the same one he'd wrapped wire around in the dark, at 12,000 feet, with 2 contractors on the mountain below them and a board meeting 8 hours away. It works, she said. I had it tested. Thank you, he said. He meant it simply. There's something else. She wrapped her hands around the coffee mug. Kessler Northstar has funded a 10-year grant program for volunteer mountain rescue teams across the western region. Equipment, training, operational costs. 12 teams across 5 states beginning this summer. She paused. It's anonymous. The company's name isn't attached to it publicly, and neither is yours. It was funded as part of a broader community safety initiative. Cole was quiet for a moment. How much? She told him. He looked at the radio again. That'll do a lot of good, he said. That's the intention. They sat with the coffee for a while, the way people sit who have been through something together that created a shared language, the kind that doesn't need much exercise to remain fluent. Outside, they could hear Sadie, somewhere in the yard, a basketball against the driveway. Then silence, then again. Damien Rusk, Cole said. Where does it stand? The federal investigation is ongoing. His counsel is negotiating. Whatever arrangement they reach, it won't be comfortable. Marlowe's voice was even. She'd moved past the part where she needed to feel things about Damien Rusk's consequences. The restructuring proposal was fully redesigned and passed last month with a clean board vote. The shell company investigation has recovered most of the diverted funds. Not all, some of it moved in ways that are going to take years to fully trace, but most. And Wesley Price cooperating fully. He's relocated. I don't know exactly where, and I think that's probably appropriate. She paused. He wasn't a hero. He was a frightened man who did something important while he was frightened, which is maybe more honest than most heroism. Probably, Cole said. Marlowe looked at her coffee. Then she said, Can I ask you something I've been thinking about for 4 months? Sure. That night in the lookout. When Damien said Sadie's name on the radio, she looked at him directly. How long did it actually take you to be certain he was bluffing? Not the answer you gave me. The actual answer. Cole was quiet for a moment. He looked at the radio on the table. About 10 seconds, he said. I was certain in about 10 seconds. And before those 10 seconds, he looked at her. Before those 10 seconds, I thought about what it would mean if I was wrong, he said. And it was about the worst thing I could think of. He paused. Then I worked through the logic, and I was certain. But those 10 seconds were real. Marlowe nodded slowly. I knew you weren't completely certain, she said. I chose to believe you anyway. I know, he said. I think that was the right call, she said. So do I, he said. But thank you for telling me. Sadie came back inside with grass on her knees and a basketball under her arm, and the expression of someone who has made a decision about the afternoon's activities and is prepared to defend it. Are you staying for dinner? She asked Marlowe, with the directness of someone who would prefer to know now so she could adjust her planning. Marlowe looked at Cole. He shrugged slightly. It's genuinely up to you. If that's all right, Marlowe said. There's chili, Sadie said. Dad made it. It's pretty good. Not as good as mine, but pretty good. I'd like that, Marlowe said. There's a thing that happens when people survive a genuine crisis together, not a manufactured one, not a controlled one, but the real kind, the kind that has an actual possibility of ending badly and requires actual decisions from actual people under actual pressure. The thing that happens is that you see each other stripped of the performance that most daily life requires. You see who someone is when the title and the income and the reputation have been replaced by a mountain in a storm and a question of what to do next. Sometimes what you see is disappointing. Sometimes it surprises you. Cole Stratham had spent 14 years operating in conditions designed to reveal exactly that what people were when everything else was removed. He'd learned that the answer wasn't always what training predicted, and wasn't always what the person themselves predicted, and that the gap between who someone thought they were and who they turned out to be under pressure was one of the most illuminating spaces you could find yourself standing in. That night in the cabin, and on the mountain, and in the fire lookout with a radio and a flash drive, and a man's voice on the frequency speaking, with the calm of someone who thought he was winning, Marlowe Kessler, had turned out to be exactly who she needed to be. Not perfectly, not without fear, or the impulse toward the wrong choice, or the moments where the exhaustion got into the edges of her judgment, but fundamentally, in the ways that counted when they counted, clear, honest, persistent, and unwilling to let someone else's cruelty become her surrender. And Cole Stratham had turned out to be, in the ways that he'd spent 6 years being uncertain about, still the man he'd been trained to be. Not because the training owned him, not because the past had reached forward and reclaimed him, but because certain things, once they become part of how you see and move and think, don't leave. They become part of your architecture, as permanent as anything else you carry. The mountain had asked him to be that man for one night. He'd been that man for one night. And then he'd driven home and had breakfast with his daughter, and gone to work at the auto shop, and called Frank DeLuca about the rental car bill, and done all the ordinary things that made up the life he'd chosen. And the choosing of it had felt, if anything, cleaner than it had before. There's no perfect way to honor what you've survived, or what you've left behind, or who you used to be. There's only what you do with the morning that comes after, and whether the life you're building is the one that actually fits the person you've become, rather than the person someone else decided you should be. Cole Stratham fixed engines. He raised his daughter. He noticed angles that other people missed, and occasionally, when the moment was right and the situation asked for it, he acted on what he noticed. He didn't need recognition for it. He didn't need the title or the money, or the acknowledgement that he was capable of more than what his daily life appeared to contain. He needed the tree line outside his daughter's window. He needed the chili in the refrigerator and the Saturday soccer games, and the story about the girl who negotiated with weather systems, which Sadie finished in February, and which got a commendation from her English teacher, and which Cole had read 3 times without telling her. He needed to be her father. That had been the mission, from the day he left the teams and drove his truck into Red Hollow with a 5-year-old asleep in her car seat, and every morning he woke up and chose it again. That was enough. That had always been enough. He just hadn't always known it so clearly until a tree across a county road told him to pay attention. Claude is AI.